Nancy loved her mother very much. She was her closest person in the entire world. She never knew her father, and her mother preferred not to discuss that topic, avoiding any mention of her youthful mistake. Of course, Nancy understood her mother's situation and thus tried to support her in everything. It's worth noting that Amanda Parker did everything to ensure that her daughter never felt inferior among her peers. Nancy's clothes didn't come from thrift stores and never looked any worse than those of her classmates. To afford that kind of life, Amanda had to work 3 jobs. During the day, she worked as a maid in a hotel, and in the evening, she took on extra cleaning jobs in the homes of affluent citizens. She often returned home around midnight, barely able to stand up straight from exhaustion. Nancy saw how hard her mother's life was, and from a young age, convinced herself that she would become a reliable support for her when she grew up. Amanda felt her daughter's support. Nancy tried to help her mother as best as she could and maintain the house in order in her absence. "You're my little helper. What would I do without you?" Amanda would say with tears in her eyes. These words always warmed Nancy's heart and improved her mood, despite the challenges at school and beyond. Time passed, bringing its own changes to the lives of Amanda Parker and her daughter. By the time Nancy finished high school, she was certain that she wouldn't be attending prom. The dress was too expensive, and she had no point in buying it. But when Amanda learned about it, she made her daughter reconsider and insist that she needed to attend the school event in a new dress. Initially, Nancy tried to stand her ground, but eventually she agreed with her mother, especially since she'd already bought her the dress. Although Amanda never told her daughter the price she had to pay for it, Nancy suspected that it was a lot. Nancy didn't want to pursue further education after graduating from high school. The most she was willing to do was take some part-time courses. Nancy wanted to start working as soon as possible to be able to help her mother. This way, she aimed to lessen her mother's burden and give her more time to rest. Nancy had to put in a lot of effort to find a job, and it took her about a month to do so. There weren't many employees willing to hire someone with no experience whatsoever. Nancy was starting to lose hope when fortune smiled upon her in the form of the owner of a trading company. Richard Miller was looking for a cleaning lady, and the young candidate immediately caught his eye. Although, to be honest, Nancy didn't really like her future boss. Not only did Richard behave very impotently when talking to her, but he also reeked of alcohol, the smell of which was extremely unpleasant to Nancy. Rumors had it that Richard used to be a promising athlete, but then he suffered from an injury during one of the competitions and had to give up sports altogether. At about that time, fate led him into the world of business, succeeding in which became his #1 goal in life. The most surprising thing was that at the age of 45, he remained unmarried and childless. None of the employees knew the reasons for this, but they did know that asking such questions directly would cost them dearly. Richard always had a stern and irritable disposition, which often hindered him in making important deals. In other words, in his head, he still lived in the world of sports and transferred this mindset to the world of business. The employees knew about this bad temper and tried not to argue with Richard, especially when he was in a foul mood and drowning his depression in a glass of whiskey. Having become a cleaner in Richard Miller's company, Nancy immediately accepted the rules of the game established within its walls. "The main thing is not to irritate the boss, and then everything will be fine," said the head of the HR department. Nancy nodded understandingly, even though she had already figured out that joking with Richard was definitely not a good idea. A month flew by. Nancy got used to her job. There wasn't really anything particularly difficult about it. The tasks were simple: keep the office clean, water the plants on time, and avoid getting in the director's way when he was in a bad mood. Nancy followed these 3 rules diligently and was mostly happy with her job. However, there was one but that did make her sad. It was her salary, which was set by the company's owner. For some inexplicable reason, her pay was significantly lower than in other companies, which couldn't but disappoint her. On top of everything else, her mother fell seriously ill and had been on sick leave for 2 weeks. Given her circumstances, Nancy desperately needed money, so she decided to have an honest conversation with her boss. Upon learning of her plan, the head of the HR department tried to dissuade Nancy. "Are you out of your mind?" Mr. Miller's important deal just fell through. Trying to talk to him now would be like going into a cage with an angry tiger. Nancy smiled. "Well, if he's a tiger today, then he needs taming." After Nancy's response, her coworkers looked at her with undisguised sympathy. Most of them understood that her conversation with Mr. Miller would likely put an end to her career as a cleaner. But Nancy had her own take on the matter. Having knocked on the director's door, she confidently walked in and looked him in the eye. "Why are you standing there? It's too early to mop the floors, so you've come for nothing. Actually, don't clean the floor here today. I might be spending the night in my office," Richard said irritably. Nancy paused for a moment, then said, "Mr. Miller, sir, I came to see you for a completely different reason." "Oh, and what reason would that be, may I ask?" Richard raised an eyebrow in surprise. Nancy had no choice but to continue, as having stepped into the director's office, she basically left herself with no option to retreat. "I need a raise, sir. Excuse me for being blunt, but the salary here is well below the market average." To say that Richard was infuriated would be a huge understatement. He was the director and the owner of the company, and he was being challenged by a mere cleaner who had the audacity to demand a raise. Richard poured himself a generous glass of whiskey, glaring at Nancy with undisguised hatred. By this time, he was fairly drunk and not fully aware of his actions. "Kiss my feet, you filthy beggar. Then I'll give you a raise. Until that happens, get out of my office." The director's words embarrassed Nancy deeply. She had never been so humiliated like that before. But instead of breaking her spirit, this realization strengthened her resolve and pushed her to take more assertive actions. To Richard's surprise, she remained standing in the office as if giving him a chance to apologize. "Am I being unclear? Get out of here," the director barked. But then Nancy said something that the entire office would discuss for days or even weeks to come. "Enough with the theatrics, Dad. You're embarrassing yourself." Taken aback, Richard stammered and dropped the glass, spilling whiskey all over the floor. "Why did you call me Dad just now? What are you talking about?" "That's right, Daddy. I found out that you were my father a year ago, when I accidentally came across a newspaper clipping with your photo in my mother's drawer, and then she told me everything." Wait. What's your mother's name?" Richard asked, surprised. Amanda Parker. You two were close, and even planned to get married, remember? Trust me, she told me everything." This flood of information made Richard dizzy. Moreover, the shock he experienced immediately sobered him up, which turned out to be quite beneficial. "Dear Lord, Amanda, why didn't she tell me that I have a daughter?" Richard muttered, covering his face with his hands. Tears welled up in the man's eyes, testifying to the fact that he was being sincere. "Mom was hurt. She was already carrying that child when you had a fight and broke up. If you don't believe me, you can get a DNA test. I'm sure it'll set things straight," Nancy explained. But Richard had heard enough. He knew that a DNA test would only confirm the truth of Nancy's words and wouldn't change his attitude towards her in any way. Having taken his daughter's hands, Richard whispered, "Forgive me, dear. I should have found you much sooner, but instead, I spend my life drinking and behaving like a complete idiot." "Oh, come on, Dad. You're not such an idiot. You did manage to start your own company after all. But I think you need to make things right with Mom. She's very sick. She needs your support now more than ever," Nancy said. Richard went to see Amanda the very next day. Only then did the businessman realize that while working at his company, his daughter deliberately tolerated her father's reckless behavior, as if giving him a chance to change. Seeing Richard standing at her doorstep with a huge bouquet of roses, Amanda raised her hands and exclaimed in surprise, "Richie, is that really you? But how did you find me?" "Yes, it's me all right. I had some help from our daughter. She worked as a cleaner at my company," Richard answered with a sincere smile. "Well, come in. I made pie. It'll be perfect with some tea." The woman invited Richard into the kitchen. Standing behind her father, Nancy smiled, thinking that half the battle was already won. Soon, the three of them were sitting in the kitchen enjoying a delicious apple pie that Amanda baked to celebrate that upcoming Independence Day. Cheerfully chatting about everything in the world, Richie and Amanda felt as if they had traveled back in time and become a couple again. Actually, that was exactly what Nancy thought looking at them. After all, their hearts were once united in love, and they didn't need a wizard or some spells to reignite the fire that had always been there.